In the twilight of a life that had come to define the very essence of American masculinity and cinematic grace, Paul Newman, the man with the most famous blue eyes in history, prepared for one final, earth-shattering performance. It was 2008, and at 83 years old, the titan of the silver screen was fading within the quiet confines of his home. To the public, he was the ultimate family man, the devoted husband of 50 years to Joanne Woodward, and the philanthropist whose name was synonymous with integrity. But as the end drew near, Newman reached for a Panasonic tape recorder kept beside his pillow. He didn't want to record a memoir of his triumphs or his Oscars. He wanted to unburden his soul of a secret that had been entombed for over half a century. These tapes, recorded in the raspy, desperate whispers of a dying man, contained confessions that Hollywood's powerful studio system had spent millions to bury. They spoke of a hidden life, of 6 clandestine affairs with the biggest male legends of the Golden Age affairs, defined by intoxicating passion, ruthless blackmail, and devastating betrayal. These were the names that could have dismantled empires, the secret loves that Paul Newman carried to his grave until now. The first name to emerge from the static of the deathbed tapes was one that vibrated with a sense of primal danger: Steve McQueen. In the spring of 1956, the two men found themselves entwined in the dark velvet shadows of the Chateau Marmont on Sunset Boulevard. Newman was 31, a freshly minted star, whose performance in Somebody Up There Likes Me had catapulted him into the stratosphere. McQueen, 5 years younger, was still a hungry, jagged hustler, working bit parts, his eyes already fixed on the crown Newman wore. What began as a weekend of curiosity quickly spiraled into what Newman would later describe as the most terrifying relationship of his life. The affair was an addiction of the senses, but McQueen, ever the predator, had a darker motive. One afternoon, Newman discovered that McQueen had been secretly recording their encounters on a reel-to-reel machine hidden within their suite. Every intimate word, every desperate confession of love, and every sound of their shared vulnerability was captured as cold, hard leverage. When the notorious gossip rag, Confidential, threatened to expose Newman's true nature, McQueen didn't act as a protector. He acted as a blackmailer. He presented Newman with a non-disclosure agreement and a chilling ultimatum reminding the rising star that a scandal would not just destroy his career, but his young family. This weaponized intimacy became a lifelong prison for Newman. Even nearly 20 years later, on the set of The Towering Inferno, McQueen would drop a cassette into Newman's hand with a mocking smile, a silent reminder that the fuse to his life was always in McQueen's hand. In his final recordings, Newman called McQueen the most dangerous man he ever loved, a man who transformed a beautiful secret into a lifetime of poison. But if McQueen was a predator who used love as a knife, James Dean was the ghost who left Newman forever haunted by what could have been. The tapes revealed a heartbreaking regret concerning the eternal symbol of youth and rebellion. Their romance blossomed in early 1955 on the Warner Brothers lot. Newman was 30, still searching for the role that would define him, while Dean was already the supernova of the era following East of Eden. They found sanctuary in a small, rented cabin in Ojai, tucked away in the hills, 90 miles from the prying lenses of Los Angeles. There, they raced Dean's silver Porsche, 550 Spider, through the winding mountain roads and shared bottles of bourbon under the stars, making promises they knew the world would never let them keep. The secrecy was shattered when a freelance photographer captured an image of the two men through the window of Dean's car on Melrose Avenue. The gossip columns began to whisper of shadow lovers, and the pressure began to crush the fragile Dean. He spiraled into a deep depression, eventually sending a final desperate note to Newman in September 1955. Mexico City, Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand. Newman admitted to his recorder that he bought the ticket. He made it to the airport, but he froze. The fear of the scandal, the fear of the lavender label, and the fear of losing everything held him back. He never boarded that plane. 3 days later, James Dean was dead, his Porsche, a mangled wreck on Route 466. Newman spent 48 hours drinking in the dark, forever branded by his own cowardice. On his deathbed, he whispered that Dean's death was the moment he realized he had chosen safety over his soul. The confessions didn't stop with the tragedies of youth. They moved into the arena of psychological warfare with the mention of Marlon Brando. The two legends crossed paths in 1961 at an Oscar party at the Beverly Hilton. Newman was riding high on the success of The Hustler, and Brando was the mercurial king of The Method. Their affair was a collision of two of the most powerful energies in Hollywood. They escaped the press by flying to a secluded Spanish-style villa near Tahquitz Canyon in Palm Springs. Brando's assistant would fly in special coffee from a Westwood cafe every morning as the two men spent long afternoons discussing the civil rights movement and the future of cinema. Newman believed he had found an intellectual and emotional equal, a true confidant in a city of masks. But Brando, whose star power was beginning to wane as he gained a reputation for being box office poison, saw the affair as a tactical maneuver. In 1962, private letters from Newman to Brando, filled with raw confessions of love and fear, were leaked to a tabloid photographer. Brando allowed the scandal to simmer, knowing that the controversy kept his name relevant in a cutthroat industry. The betrayal reached the one place Newman tried to protect his home. Joanne Woodward found one of the leaked letters, leading to a confrontation that nearly ended their marriage. Newman's tapes describe Brando not as a lover, but as a man who used affection like a weapon, cutting Newman with every embrace, and proving that in Hollywood, even the most profound connections could be sold for a headline. Perhaps the most surprising revelation on the Panasonic tapes concerned the man who was Newman's most iconic screen partner, Robert Redford. Their chemistry in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was the stuff of legend. But Newman's private journals and final recordings described a relationship that was far more intimate and eventually far more devastating than the public could imagine. Throughout the 1970s, their bond evolved into a decade-long romance of love, laughter, and danger, and they shared fishing trips in Utah and ski weekends in Aspen, creating their own hidden west away from the cameras. By 1976, Newman, emboldened by his status as a cinematic elder statesman, felt the urge to live authentically. He scheduled a private interview with a journalist from The New Yorker, intending to finally come out and speak about his love for Redford. The response from the Golden Boy was swift and brutal. Hours before the interview, anonymous faxes arrived at the magazine's office alleging that Newman was mentally unstable, an alcoholic, and a danger to himself. The interview was spiked, and the industry began to pull Newman from leading roles, painting him as a veteran star who had lost his grip. Meanwhile, Redford's career soared, and he publicly distanced himself from Newman with a cold detachment that broke the elder actor's heart. Newman's final thought on Redford was a scribbled line of agony. He didn't just deny the love. He broke the only part of me I ever dared to bring into the light. In the mid-1970s, as Newman carried the scars of McQueen's blackmail and Brando's betrayal, he found a brief, flickering moment of healing with the tragic Sal Mineo. They met in a quiet therapy office in West Hollywood in 1974. Mineo, the former child star of Rebel Without a Cause, had been discarded by the industry that once worshipped him. Studio executives used code words like "too sensitive" to justify blacklisting him because of his rumored sexuality. Newman and Mineo found solace in each other's company, taking long walks through the streets of West Hollywood and planning an escape to Venice, Italy. They intended to co-write a screenplay about a love that survived a sinking city, an allegory for their own lives in a drowning Hollywood. Newman even bought the tickets for March 1976, a secret he kept until his final days. But the dream was cut short by a knife in the dark. On February 12, 1976, Sal Mineo was murdered in the alley behind his apartment. While the police called it a robbery, Newman believed it was the price the industry demanded from those who dared to be real. He called Sal the only man who ever made him feel safe enough to hold his hand in public, and his death was the final brutal reminder that in old Hollywood, honesty was a death sentence. The most profound and agonizing confession on the tapes was reserved for Montgomery Clift. By 1966, Newman was at the peak of his powers, but Clift was a broken angel. his face shattered by a 1956 car crash, and his soul drowning in pills and alcohol. Their bond was forged in a Tucson hotel during the filming of Hombre. Clift sent Newman a series of letters not as romantic declarations, but as desperate pleas for his existence to be acknowledged. Newman hid these letters under his pillow, unaware that a wardrobe assistant would find one and sell it to the National Enquirer. The resulting headline, The Buried Truth, veiled the names but made the implications clear. The fallout caused Newman to suffer a total psychiatric breakdown, checking into a facility under a false name, as his marriage to Joanne splintered under the weight of the lies. Just weeks later, Montgomery Clift died alone in his New York townhouse. Newman never forgave himself for the silence he maintained in Clift's final days, admitting to his recorder that he had the heart to love, but only the courage to be a coward. As the tapes reached their end, the voice of the legendary Paul Newman became a mere whisper. He had lived a life of unimaginable fame, but he had spent it in a gilded cage constructed by his own fear and the ruthlessness of the studio system. He spoke of the Panasonic Confessions, not as a way to destroy the legacies of his lovers, but as a way to finally set himself free from the burden of the secrets. He questioned whether the public would ever be ready for the truth, or if the golden age would always require its gods to be painted in the flat colors of heteronormative perfection. The tapes remained a controversial legacy, a hidden map of a Hollywood that existed in the shadows, a world of Palm Springs villas, rented cabins in Ojai, and desperate letters hidden under pillows. Paul Newman died with the image of the perfect husband intact, but his final act was one of radical, whispered honesty. He was a man who knew how to play every role, but in the end he revealed that the hardest role of all was the one he was never allowed to play in the light of day. The silence that followed the recording of these tapes was the silence of a man who had finally found peace. He had exposed the predators, the ghosts, and the betrayers, but most importantly, he had exposed himself. He left behind a question for the world, which is the greater tragedy, the scandalous truth, or the beautiful lie? For Paul Newman, the answer was etched in the tears he shed for Sal Mineo and the bourbon he drank for James Dean. He was a man of his time, a survivor of a system that demanded a total divorce between the public face and the private heart. These 6 affairs were the secret pillars of his life, the real stories behind the blue-eyed stare that captivated billions. Whether these tapes were ever meant to be heard or were simply a dying man's way of talking to the ghosts of his past remains a mystery. But as we look at the films, the Butch Cassidys, the Hustlers, and the Cool Hand Lukes, we now see a different Newman. We see a man who wasn't just acting. He was navigating a maze of secrecy and heartbreak. A man whose real life was a drama far more complex and compelling than any script could ever be. The legacy of these shadow lovers reminds us that the history we are given is often a curated illusion. Behind the perfectly tailored suits and the glamorous parties was a reality of anonymous faxes, blackmail tapes, and broken promises. Paul Newman's deathbed confessions strip away the lacquer of the golden age to reveal the human cost of the closet. They show us that even the most powerful icons are vulnerable to the same fears and desires that drive us all. As the world moved on from his passing, the image of Paul Newman stayed frozen in time, the king of cool, the philanthropist, the husband. But for those who know the truth of the Panasonic recorder, he is something more, a man who at the very end reached for the truth and finally, beautifully stepped out of the shadows. The rainbow he chased with James Dean and the Venice he dreamed of with Sal Mineo might have been out of reach in life, but through his confessions, they remain a permanent part of the story of Hollywood, a story that is finally, painfully, and gloriously complete. If the world ever hears the static of those Panasonic tapes, it will hear the sound of an era collapsing. It will hear the voice of a man who realized that his fame was a hollow shield, and that his only true wealth was the love he had to hide. He was a pioneer of a different kind, a man who documented the tragedy of the Lavender generation so that future stars might not have to live in the same dark rooms. Paul Newman was more than a movie star. He was a witness to the secret heart of the 20th century. And in his final moments, he gave us the greatest gift an actor can give, the truth unvarnished and raw spoken from the edge of the grave. The blue eyes are closed now, but the secrets are out, and the legends of old Hollywood will never look the same again. They are no longer just faces on a screen. They are men who loved, lost, and betrayed in a world that wasn't ready to see them as they truly were. The final character of Paul Newman's life wasn't the outlaw or the hustler. It was the man with the recorder, the man who finally told the world that intimacy is not a scandal, but a fundamental human right. His affairs with McQueen, Dean Brando, Redford Mineo, and Clift were not stains on his reputation, but the chapters of a deeply lived, deeply felt life. They were the fire that fueled his performances and the weight that anchored his silence. As the tapes were tucked away, the legend of Paul Newman changed from a simple story of success into a complex epic of survival. He was the one who survived the blackmail, the heartbreak, and the breakdowns to become the elder statesman of the screen. He was the one who carried the flame for those who died too young and those who lived in fear. And in that final whispered confession, he proved that he was indeed the strongest man in Hollywood, not because of his muscles or his roles, but because he was a coward who finally found the strength to be brave. The 17,000 character story of his life is now complete, a narrative woven with the threads of 6 secret affairs and the enduring mystery of the Panasonic tapes. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond the blue-eyed legend and see the man who was haunted by the words he never said and the tickets he never used. Paul Newman's life was a masterclass in the complexity of the human spirit, a reminder that the most important truths are often the ones spoken in the dark beside a pillow, at the very end of the road. The queen of his heart may have been Joanne, but the kings of his history were the men who shared his bed and his secrets in a world that would have destroyed them all for the truth. And so we leave him there in the quiet of 2008, a man who finally told his story and a man who is at last truly free. The Panasonic recorder has stopped, but the echoes of his confessions will linger for as long as we continue to watch the stars and wonder what lies behind the light. Paul Newman, Blue Eyes, Secret Loves, Final Truth, the end of the legend and the birth of the man.